Welcome to Unit 3, which we'll call Food, the Literary Genre. And before we begin Unit 3, I want to make a few points that will frame some of the content as we go forward. The first is that all real food is inherently good. Yes, you have unprocessed vegetables and mushrooms that are poisonous or can cause harm, but we're talking about the produce section of the grocery store. And yes, some people respond negatively to certain foods, but as a general statement, unprocessed, unadulterated food is going to be good for us. Next, there are no food labels on broccoli, potatoes, or even steak unless it's been processed. So real unprocessed food does not require a label. On the flip side, just because it doesn't have a label doesn't make it real unprocessed. Store-brand fresh squeezed orange juice doesn't require a label since it's from real food, oranges, but it's still been processed. Personal responsibility starts with knowledge. And there are many ways for us as consumers to gather information about food. Older family members, teachers, coaches, friends, nutrition courses, commercials. But the front line of public education for food items is the nutrition facts label. But as I alluded to before, the more labels you're reading, the more processed garbage you're probably buying. So keep that into consideration. In this unit, we'll take a look at what is actually on the label. Our goal while reading these is typically to determine whether the item will lead to improved or worse health, but understand that information necessary to improve health might not be on the label, or if it is on the label, it might be in ambiguous terms that don't tell us that much. We'll also talk about non-dietary related labels, which typically relate to the conditions in which the product was developed or raised, with inferences of ecological health, animal welfare, or freshness. So let's start with the nutrition facts label. Our assumption is that the food we eat will either make us healthier or push us in some fashion towards the other side of this continuum into sickness. For the health-conscious consumer reading food labels, the goal of the label is to inform us of this effect, but that view is very simplistic. There's nuance that gets in the way. First, the negative consequences associated with the food we eat is likely due to the postprandial, that's after a meal environment, that's created and or the promotion of long-term effects on the sensitivity of our neurons and our hormones, the makeup of our bacteria, the cellular damage that may occur, or the storage of toxins in this period. What if we exercised prior to eating the food, or if we were fasted for a long time? Our postprandial response is likely different. And because we are all different to some extent, we have what's known as biochemical individuality, our responses to food may be different person to person. Another wrench in the simplistic continuum thought is food pairing. Does a healthful food in a meal cancel out an unhealthy food? We know that the pairing of food can lead to increased or decreased rates of absorption of certain nutrients for good or for bad. Next up is the concept of moderation. So what is moderation? We can define it as what our body expects of us, perhaps from an evolutionary perspective, that's how we would define it, or we can define it as a relative comparison to societal norms. The evolutionary side might say that Cheez-Its are so far removed from what our body expects to be exposed to that they will inevitably lead to dysfunction. The societal norm side might say that as long as we limit ourselves to a few handfuls a day and don't down the whole box on a road trip, that we won't be negatively impacted. The fact is, our body can probably handle a little bit, but knowing how little that is can be total guesswork, and it can make the whole concept of moderation very infuriating. So in May of 2016, the FDA announced a brand new food label in order to reflect new scientific information and prioritize informing the public of links between diet and chronic diseases. And a major focus was to make it easier for consumers to make informed choices about their food. For larger manufacturers with over $10 million in annual sales, these labels will show up on your shelves. It's mandatory by January 1st, 2020. And smaller companies have an extra year to do so. Many products already have made the switch. So let's take a look and see what's different. On every label, we see how much we're getting of some of the most deficient micronutrients, vitamin D, calcium, iron, and potassium. It used to be that you only saw the percentage, but now you see the absolute amount in micrograms or milligrams. The footnote statement was rewritten about 2,000 calories being a general approximation for our needs. And new scientific evidence from the Institute of Medicine and the USDA's Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report was used to update the recommended daily allowance of fiber and vitamin D and sodium, among others. And one critique of this is that a daily value for fiber, vitamins, and minerals represents the minimum you should have, but the daily value for sugar, saturated fat, and sodium represents the maximum that you should have. Of course, you just need to know this as a consumer because it doesn't tell you. Theoretically, an unwitting person could say, the good news is I reached my sodium goal, but unfortunately I went far above the fiber goal they set for me. What made the most headlines with the new food label was the amount of food product represented on the label. That the serving size must be based on the amount of food and beverage that people are actually eating, not what they should be eating. When people get a 20-ounce Coke, they typically consume it in one sitting, of course. So the nutrition facts label should represent the entire Coke. That shouldn't be 2 servings of a Coke. For products that are larger than a single serving but can be consumed in 1 or multiple servings, manufacturers now need to show dual columns to indicate the amount per serving and the amount per package. And this has had pretty universal support and hopefully will help make the label a little bit more understandable for people. And let's now take a look at the macronutrient rows towards the middle of the label. Recall that we can convert grams of carbohydrates and fats and proteins to calories by knowing how many calories are in a gram of each. So let's look at the total carbohydrates recommendation. The percentage daily value is based on the premise that the total daily value of carbohydrates makes up 60% of your calories from the referenced 2,000 calorie diet. 60% of 2,000 calories is 1,200 calories, and divide that by 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate, and you get 300 grams of carbohydrate to meet the daily value. If you take the 37 grams of carbohydrates from this label, whatever this food is, and divide that by 300, you get 12.3%. Interestingly, rounding is different with the new label. 12.3% used to show up as 12% as they used to round down, and now it shows up as 13% because now they round up. The fat recommendation changed a little bit more. Instead of recommending fat make up 30% of your total calories per day, it now sets the goal at 35% of your calories per day. And this is so that consumers won't be misled to limit fat intake. Remember, fat isn't viewed as bad as we used to think that it was. Saturated and trans fat, yes, but unsaturated is a very healthy way to eat. And this chart very nicely shows the changes in daily values for these nutrients. Some notable ones: sodium dropped from 2,400 milligrams to 2,300. Not much. In fact, this gets some criticism for still being too high. Dr. Lustig says people consuming 800 milligrams per day get by just fine. The daily value for fiber ended up going up by 3 grams to 28. We'll see if that changes the fiber consumption or not by Americans. And potassium also made a big jump, which should be viewed as a very good thing after watching those videos from our last unit. But by far the best news, and the reason why talking about this label is so relevant, is that sugar now finally has a percentage next to it. And better yet, the label now differentiates added sugars, those added during the processing or packaging of foods. Now, the daily value tagged on sugar as a whole is 10%, which means we should keep our intake of sugar to less than 10% of our daily calories, or 50 grams for those of you consuming 2,000 calories per day. This new row and percentage has become a flashpoint, sparking some strong opinions. The founder of The Center for Science in the Public Interest applauded the move and says that this should spur food manufacturers to add less sugar to their products. Meanwhile, the Sugar Association called this a dangerous precedent that is not grounded in science. I think they might need to read some more research papers. It's an obvious critique, but the food label talks more about quantity of nutrients than quality of nutrients. You don't see how many omega-3s or omega-6s you're consuming when you just look at total fat. When you look at protein, it doesn't tell you how many are from animal products compared to plant products, although looking at the ingredients list typically helps answer that question. Also, the differences in starch aren't described. You don't know how much amylose the product contains compared to amylopectin, the type of starch that gets absorbed rapidly. But there is a method you can use to quantify starch in general. If you start with the total carbs and you remove the dietary fiber and then remove the total sugars, you're left with starch. A rule of thumb is to keep this number below 60 grams per serving and below about 200 grams per day. Of course, if you're exercising and replenishing your depleted glycogen stores, then that's a good time to consume the starchy carbohydrates. Overall, the chatter of the new food label appears to be very positive, with many viewing it as a step in the right direction, though a lot of public health professionals and researchers wish that it would go a bit further to inform consumers of those nuances of what exactly you want more of or less of.